My name is Bridget Terry Long. I'm very proud to be the dean here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And today, I'm especially thrilled with this wonderful panel you have before you. An incredible group of leaders who, although they have their roots in Chicago, we've somewhat adopted them here, given how much time they spend on Appian Way. They visited our campus in the past to share their insights on real-world challenges and to support the development. I think in some cultures that's good luck. Just be really careful if you're over here. We're gonna keep moving though. Like I said, they've been to Appian Way so often that we've adopted them, supporting our work as an institution and also supporting aspiring and developing leaders. To share a bit more about each one of them, Arne Duncan, our former U.S. Secretary of Education, is currently managing partner at Emerson Collective, an organization dedicated to removing barriers so people can live to their full potential. A graduate of Harvard College and a former professional basketball player in Australia. In fact, he worked out with the Harvard basketball team this morning. He also just happened to serve as CEO of the Chicago Public Schools from 2001 to 2008. He's been a regular presence here and served as a member of HGSE's visiting committee while he was Chicago's CEO. Janice has spent nearly 23 years working for the Chicago Public Schools, first as a social studies teacher, then principal, then chief of schools in Network 9, then chief education officer, before becoming Chicago's superintendent and CEO for nearly 4 years up until September 2021. Janice has also been a wonderful member of HGSE's visiting committee. She'll be back this spring. And she's currently CEO of Hope Chicago, a nonprofit organization seeking to reduce economic and social inequities by funding the post-secondary costs for Chicago public school graduates and adult family members. And finally, it's wonderful to welcome Pedro, the current CEO of the Chicago Public Schools. He formerly served as superintendent of the San Antonio Independent School District and superintendent of the Washoe County School District, which includes Reno, Nevada. Pedro's roots go deep in Chicago. He immigrated there from Mexico at the age of 6 and completed high school there, then going to U of I, and then back to Chicago for his MBA. Pedro previously worked for CPS, serving as budget director under Arne Duncan when he was CEO. Full circle. So another thing that Arne, Janice, and Pedro have in common is their affiliation and support of Harvard's Public Education Leadership Project, known informally as PELP. PELP is an innovative partnership between HGSE and Harvard Business School, also including a number of faculty from Harvard Kennedy School. It is co-directed by HGSE's Jen Cheatham, our moderator today. And John Kim of HBS, who unfortunately could not be here this evening. For 2 decades now, PELP has partnered with urban school districts from across the country. I believe it's now 58 districts at last count, to test and develop new management theories and practices aimed at improving teaching, learning, and student outcomes. Training, launching, and supporting education leaders is core to what HGSE does. We are a school that develops leaders across a variety of roles and dimensions, empowering our students with the knowledge and skills they need to become effective drivers of change for learning communities around the world. And while a leadership position can be profoundly rewarding, it is also profoundly challenging, and I think we'll hear a bit about that. So we must do everything we can to develop effective education leaders so they have the opportunity to make an incredible impact for learners and their families. So I'm proud that Arne, Janice, and Pedro can be with us today to offer their thoughts on what fuels education leaders, how to sustain progress over time amid changing contexts and changing political realities, how district leaders can find and set their North Star, a consistent guide through all the change, and about how to sustain their own effectiveness and well-being at the same time. They'll also offer us an insider's look at Chicago's impressive progress and its continuing challenges. So please join me again in welcoming Arne, Janice, and Pedro. And I'm now happy to pass to Jen, who will take over. Please, if anyone is coming up here, watch the
Be careful. All right, everybody. This is like a dream discussion. I've been fantasizing about this. I really have. I want to thank you all for being here. Before we jump in, I do want to give a couple of shout outs. Jody Smith-Bennett plans these events. Can we give Jody a huge round of applause? Love you, Jody. I also want to thank the EDLD students who are here in this front row. These are PELP facilitators that I've gotten the pleasure of working with, and they helped me craft the questions. They helped kind of arrange the whole day. Can we give them a round of applause as well? Thank you. And of course, I want to thank this incredible audience for showing up. We're going to have a very instructive conversation, to say the least. Not only do we have students in our audience, which I think may be obvious, we have some alum in the audience, I'm noticing, which is thrilling. We also have some local practitioners in the audience. We've got faculty members in the audience, and we've got people live streaming in, including a Chicago watch party right now. I think there are about 20-some people over HGSC alum watching from Chicago. Okay, so before we jump in, I want to say a few quick things. I want to start by showing you this picture. In the last 20 years, Chicago has seen its fair share of leadership change. Since Arne took the reins in 2001, there have been 9 other CEOs, 10 in 20 years, counting interim CEOs. The time period after Arne left to lead the Department of Education, there were 4 CEOs in 4 years. I was there as a senior leader during those years and can attest, and happy to fill in some of the gaps. Janice then brought on a period of stability, I would say, where she was both Chief Education Officer and then CEO. And then, of course, Pedro was hired in 2021. But despite it all, this is why we're really here, and why I am so curious. Despite all of that leadership change and churn, there has been consistent growth on multiple important measures. In Chicago, graduation rates have grown steadily over 2 decades, while also dramatically decreasing dropout rates. College enrollment rates have also seen enormous growth, 50% since 2004. In 2017, Stanford's Sean Reardon concluded that CPS students were learning and growing faster than 96% of students in the United States. This is a district that serves primarily students of color and students who are economically disadvantaged. Sorry, I'm going to go to my next piece of paper here. There are plenty of seemingly intractable issues, though. I just want to name some of the obvious ones. Enrollment challenges. Issues of access, academic challenges, student mental health and safety challenges, funding issues, many of them made worse by the pandemic. There have also been controversial decisions that have been made and dilemmas along the way that have caused harm in the city. So, this is real talk. But there is a story here about sustainability of progress despite leadership turnover and turbulence that we want to mine today. We want to understand what has made it possible to stay relatively true to a consistent vision, theory, and strategy amidst an ever-changing environment. Now, each of these 3 leaders have very unique perspectives, and Bridget has highlighted some of them. Of course, Arne, because of his work across the country, and really to some degree around the world, has a very broad perspective. Janice, because of her coming up through the system, has this very deep perspective. And Pedro has served in 3 different school districts, right? It has a lot of insight into how context changes the way you think about the work. So I really want to bring that to bear in our conversation today. My hope is that we can have a candid conversation that will open up a much needed conversation about what it takes to sustain positive change in all of our communities. Okay, we're going to get started. And we're going to go in chronological order, Arne. So I'm going to start with you.
We're going first.
Yeah, in other words. We're going to do a quick 3 minutes each. Each of you has a very personal connection to Chicago. What is that connection, and why did you want to lead the Chicago Public Schools? And if you could also add, what were the most significant contextual aspects when you were stepping into the role? Go ahead, Arne.
And I'll try and keep it brief, because I really want to get to your guys' questions, so we'll keep our answers short. Let me just give a little more context to Jen, just because I think the chronology and the history is pretty interesting. So previous to me, there was a CEO, Paul Vallis, who served for 7 years. Then I served for 7.5 years before I went to DC. So we basically had 15 years of stability.
Right.
And we both made mistakes, we had lots of problems, none of this is perfect. We had 15 years of stability.
Yeah.
We then had 6 superintendents in 8 years. So absolute chaos. And just one of them went to jail. So that's where we were. Yeah. Thank God, thank goodness.
I didn't go to jail.
Yeah.
Clear.
She's on the work release program now.
Yes.
And this is not instant, and just be very honest, she should have got the job before she did. Mm-hmm. And so often black women come in and clean up when white men mess up. Yeah. And that's what happened here. Yeah. And Janice came in, she had an amazing run. She had some challenges with the previous administration. She left, and I really thought Pedro was the only guy in the country who could do the job.
Yeah. Agreed.
And so I pushed very hard behind the scenes and knew how much he cared about the city. So to have, you started in 17?
Yeah.
So we're at 24. So now we've had 7 years of continuity.
Yeah.
Hopefully Pedro will stay, but you guys know most urban districts, my facts won't be exactly right, but the turnover is every 2.5 years. Yeah. And you can't run a school system, a business, a nonprofit if you have that kind of turnover. So we all made lots of mistakes, but just having some continuity and stability is really important. Other contextual thing is that we have had an appointed school board, meaning the mayor appoints the leaders. And that is now changing. And that is very significant. And I always want to be honest that some folks think a appointed board is less democratic. I argue the opposite. We had 7 board members. I was directly accountable. If I did a bad job, if the board did a bad job, at that point, Mayor Daley gets fired.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We're moving to an appointed board with how many members?
20.
Elected board of how many?
20.
20 members. How does anyone know who they are? How is there any accountability? There's no nonprofit, for-profit business that has 20 leaders, and I worry it's set up for failure. So just trying to provide context on those things. Quickly answer your question. Yeah. We're all Chicago kids, and that Pedro's done something. I could not have been a superintendent in other cities. I could only do it in Chicago, so Pedro's perspective is really interesting. I only thought I could do it because I knew the streets, I knew the people, I knew the communities. I grew up there, and that tie was very important. But I had started a small public school on the outside. I had run a small nonprofit with I Have a Dream program, had 40 kids in I Have a Dream, 400 in the small school we started at Aero Community Academy, and CPS had 400,000 kids at that point. And so the math of it is very easy to critique a system from the outside. It's different to go inside and try and have impact and think about 40 to 400 to 400,000, that if you really wanted to make a difference and take all the lessons I learned growing up in my mother's program, you had to do that from inside.
Yeah. Thank you. Janice. Oh, actually, we're going chronologically.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm younger.
Yeah, I was going to say, not by age.
No problem. Okay, good. Just to be clear, I didn't go to jail, and I'm the youngest person on this stage. So, but happy to be here. A couple things, and I'll try to resist the urge to provide even more context. I know we'll get into that in the questions, but I'll just share a little bit about my journey to the role of superintendent and CEO. I did not initially have dreams of becoming a superintendent for Chicago Public Schools. I wasn't like a weird kid in high school who thought I wanted to be a principal or even a superintendent. My original goal when I went to college was to be a history professor. And like so many, I did not have an opportunity where I could go and do that and get my master's and doctorate and just think and learn and write. And so from a practical standpoint, I needed to teach. And I started teaching in Chicago public schools, and two things happened that led me to the superintendency. One was the fact that I really thought something had changed dramatically in the school system, because what the students in the school where I was working, received was very different than what I received at Hyde Park High School, which at the time, it wasn't a selective enrollment school, but they had a selective program. This kind of predates some of the selective enrollment schools that we, Arne started opening and we opened later. And so I really could not reconcile the fact that me and my siblings who went to other selective programs in the city had a completely different education experience in the district than the kids that I was working with. And so something was just ignited in me. I think the second thing was, and I'm not saying it's just because he's on the stage, is working at the time under Arne's leadership, which if you take us back to 99, what was happening then, he ushered in a lot of reform and just energy around thinking about schooling differently. And that was energizing to me as a practitioner and as a leader. And so coupled with like what I was seeing, this newfound, like, this is what I'm meant to do, I decided to, I finished my first history master's, but I shifted completely to focus on educational leadership. And at 24, I wrote on my graduate school application that I'm going to be the superintendent of Chicago, wow. Nowhere else. Wow. Superintendent of Chicago by the time that I'm 40, and that's exactly what happened.
Whoa, manifest that, right?
And for the aspiring soups in the room, I didn't write that for glitz and glory, because headline, there's no glitz, there's no glory. If you want a job where everybody tells you what to do, become a superintendent. And it wasn't about money or anything like that, because for the amount of hours and stress, you make about $2 per hour. Nice. But it really was about the ability to make an impact. And also because I felt challenged, because a lot of people said, you can't be the leader of this district. At the time, it was a $5 or $6 billion organization. You're an educator. They're never going to pick somebody like you to lead. I remember one of my peers said that to me, who's still a good friend to this day. And if nothing else, I wanted to prove him and others who thought like that wrong. And it was one of the best professional decisions that I ever made. But I don't think it would have happened anywhere except Chicago, because the conditions were just set. And again, the leadership that Arne provided, I won't tell a longer story, but he was actually the reason I became a principal when I did, which was a longer story. But I don't know that was happening everywhere. It was happening in Chicago, and it was a great place to be leading and teaching at that time.
Thank you, Janice. Yeah. Pedro, how about you?
So, my story goes a little bit back because I grew up in Chicago. I graduated from Benito Juarez High School in 1987. And one of the things I learned later, I didn't know at the time, was that was the year that Secretary Page declared Chicago the worst district in the country.
Bennett.
Sorry. Secretary Bennett. Yeah. And, and I learned that later. And even now, when I think about it, my whole trajectory was in CPS. And there were teachers that saw something in me. Mr. Asher in 6th grade, Mr. Tibbet in 7th and 8th grade, high school teachers. I was one of those kids, you needed a relay of teachers. It wasn't just one. And made a complete difference in my life. But during that time, I started with 700 freshmen in Benito Juarez. Only 170 of us graduated. So when you put in context that our graduation rate was, close to 42% in 2001, which is when Arne started, think about what it probably was in 1987 when I graduated. Wow. First in my family to go to college. My parents have a second grade education, oldest of 12, 10 of us still alive. By the way, 3 teachers in the family that are all CPS, all union strong teachers, by the way. They told the union president, don't worry, we will hold them accountable. You don't have to worry. So that was what I came into. And went in, actually worked in the private sector, then worked in the nonprofit, and then found my way back in education, actually being part of Arne's team. And I remember in those early years, I will tell you, as I learned more about the district, frankly, I became angry. Mm-hmm. And I became even more determined to really figure out how do we improve the system. And so that eventually led to a lot of mentoring. Arne Barbarosin-Watkins, who was our chief education officer, who basically said, you really got to really channel that energy and go into education. And that was never even part of what I was thinking about. Went back to school, got my certifications, and then I became a chief academic officer actually in Southern Nevada, and then became a superintendent in the last 3 districts. What brought me back to Chicago So I was doing really well in San Antonio. I just got to tell you, and you can don't take my word for it. You can talk to the community there. We had done a lot of changes, a lot of great improvements for children. Not always the most popular, but unfortunately, frankly, when you're making changes, you're not going to gain popularity. And then, actually Janice called me first. She said, Pedro, this is what I'm thinking of leaving. And I just remember having this moment of, and I remember talking to my wife, and my wife said, we're good here. And she, by the way, she grew up in Chicago, Benito Juarez grad as well. What's even a funnier story is I talked to my 3 sisters who are teachers. And they're like, San Antonio really likes you, right? I'm like, yeah. They just renewed your contract? Yeah. You've survived 3 different board elections? Yeah. Pretty much they'll do anything to keep you, right? I said, yeah. So I said, so what we're hearing is the ex-girlfriend just happened to look at you. And by the way, that ex-girlfriend is not a kind girlfriend. And you're going to leave the current girlfriend who loves you. I said, well, I never thought about it that way. But bottom line, what it felt like for me, especially because we were in the peak of the pandemic, I was watching, I had seen that, under Janice, others, even despite all the turnover, the systems were still strong in the district. I had a personal interest because I was with Arne and the cabinet team as we were building those systems, as Janice was also as a school leader. And so I have always had a vested interest in it, because that was my grounding in education. That's what really allowed me to become the leader that I became. And I could sense that there was going to be, that there was instability. I could sense it. And so when I thought about it, for me, it felt a moral obligation. Yeah. It felt like I needed to come back. And even the former mayor, she would say this. She's like, you're the son of Chicago, basically. You're coming back when the district needs you the most. Of course, it's always more complicated than that. But really, that's what brought me back is knowing that when I think about my grounding, and my parents did the best they could, everybody. I always say they didn't choose to be poor. My father didn't say, give me 2 jobs, pay me sub wages. They didn't have that choice. And it was teachers in CPS. It was my work experience in CPS that helped me find my calling to education. Yeah. And so it just felt like it was the right thing to do to come back and make sure that this progress continued.
I'm glad we've slowed down on these introductions because there's so much richness here, right, in the calling. I hope everyone's hearing that. That when you look back at that picture of the churn, that there's actually a different story underneath it about people kind of very intentionally supporting one another, passing the baton. There's so much more to say.
I had 2 quick things, sorry. Really quick, just to force me to reflect a little bit today, coming here, that it's interesting. The other 6 superintendents between us 2, we never worked together.
Right.
They weren't sort of part of the team, and we 3 had worked together. Again, lots of mistakes. I'm always going to qualify that, but there was something in that chemistry that didn't quite work. And the other thing for me is young leaders. Like the mayor gave me I took over at 36. That was sort of crazy. I went home a lot nicer and told my wife, I think I'm going to get fired tomorrow. She's like, okay, we'll figure it out. But I was given a chance at 36. When did you become a principal?
26.
26, that's when we gave her. When did you become our budget director?
Well, I was in my 30s, and my first superintendency, I was 40.
Yeah. So just something to think about, that there's a lot of, you don't have to wait till you're 50. Yeah. We need to give young people opportunity. I always give the mayor credit for taking a huge risk on me, but I saw she was a superstar. I knew how great Pedro was coming in from the outside. And they both have handled a lot of really difficult personal situations. Janice has been personally impacted by gun violence. What I remember most about Pedro is his 2 sisters coming to work every day after school and him helping them on the math homework in the office. And it's a different mentality, it's a different mindset. And that's it's not, they're brilliant, they're all that stuff, but there's a lot of heart in these 2, and I want you guys to understand
that. Right, heart, it's personal. Okay, we can just stay here. All right, okay, come on, Jen. Let's move on. So that's the backdrop. Who these leaders are really matters in relationship to the context, this city that you love. I want to talk about what we love to talk about here at Harvard, theory of change and strategy. So despite the kind of churn that happened in between, especially, there has been like some stability around like the basic theory of change and strategy.
Yeah.
It's really quite phenomenal. And Janice, because you've been there through it all, you have been like the consistent thread. Tell us about like what are the like major elements of that theory of change, like the consistent ones.
Well, first let me give my one commercial around additional context, and then I'll jump into that.
Okay.
We have had a lot of turnover at the superintendency level, but one thing that I do want people to understand is throughout that process, there was consistency in some other places, which kind of tie into this.
It does.
With leadership from the mayor. Mayor Daley was the leader of Chicago for 24 years or something like that. And then Rahm Emanuel. We also had a board that was in place pretty consistently over all of that you've seen. And so there was some consistency. But one of the key components to our success was a focus on principal leadership. And I feel like for the district leaders or aspiring district leaders in the room, you have to pay attention to that. As a large urban district, we could not source 20-something thousand quality teachers for our classrooms every day, but we could identify 660 strong leaders, and there was a public-private partnership that worked to actually do that. We were very strategic about identifying the right leaders for the right schools, and a lot of work was put into that process. So I think principal leadership was critically important. And I know when that work started, principal retention at the end of each year was around 70%. When I left, which was in the middle of the pandemic, even after that full year, it was around 93%.
That's amazing.
And so if you don't know what the principal retention rate is in your district, that's the first question you should figure out, and make sure that you have a strategy around that, because I don't care who the superintendent is, if you don't have leadership at the ground level, it's going to be hard to keep that work going. I think the second part of our theory of change was this focus on data and analytics, and as you described it, human-centered data analysis, where number one, we're going to pay attention to data. We're going to track it. We're going to use it to be strategic. We're going to implement cycles of continuous improvement in order to move the district forward. And we're going to train people at every level to pay attention to that. That was not just something that was done within the district. Once again, this notion of public-private partnerships came into play. We had a strong partnership, the district still does, with the University of Chicago, the Consortium on School Research. I think we're on year 35 or something, of where they have unfettered access to all the student data in CPS. And when I say that to other superintendents, they're like, you're crazy. And I will tell you, and throughout the discussion today, we'll be able to cite different examples. The fact that they were looking at our data, they would come to us with issues, whether it was the potholes report that I'm sure you were presented with, the on-track work. The fact that we were working with this institution and we trusted them enough. It wasn't always pretty. We argued. I threw some of their reports out, like, Suge Avery threw that breakfast out. If you watch Color Purple, you know what I'm talking about. But at the end of the day, we entered this partnership with them, and they would bring to us a mirror as to what's happening in the district and force us to act upon that. So I think that was a big part of our theory of change. And then the third piece, which, has evolved, and I'm sure Pedro will pick up on some of this, but really college as a North Star. We really had to reset from what CPS was like when I was a student. I often tell a story. I remember being in study hall, a room similar to this, and someone came in from the counselor's office and passed out the ACT packet. And I don't know why they gave me one and didn't give 70% of the other kids in the room the same packet. That was CPS in the early 90s when I was a student there. They decided somewhere through a test, maybe something you said, how you behave, how you present yourself, that you're college ready and you're college material, so do these things to go. And fast forward under Arne's leadership, and what we kept going forward was like, no, we're going to create universal policies to make sure every student has what they need in their back pocket to pursue a post-secondary, career. And it's up to them to decide if they're going to do it. But everybody's going to take the ACT or SAT. Everybody's going to fill out a FAFSA form. Everybody's going to fill out college applications. I mean, there are a lot of universal policies that I think we take for granted in Chicago that have led to some of the outcomes that you've seen. So that college as a North Star has been a big part of that. It has evolved, so I'll let Pedro pick it up, because I do know that he's focusing a lot more on the career and technical piece, which I would admit wasn't as strong of a focus, but definitely something that needed to be strengthened.
Can I just unpack this a little bit
Yeah,
more,
I'll
Janice? I
start
mean, I love how you laid that out. The focus on principles, where did that come from? Arne, was that you?
Yeah,
Like,
it was
how
before.
did that start?
Well, I mean, Janice said it perfectly, that you try and always figure out in any job, where do you have leverage? And how many teachers do you have now?
So we have 22,000.
Yeah, so we had 25,000, but you can't hire 25,000. But 600 principals, to be clear, principals are CEOs. They're managing people, they're managing budgets, they're managing facilities, they're managing the media. And we all know great principals attract and retain talent, and bad principals repel and discourage that talent. So what are your leverage points? You have to try and get the best people you can to lead those schools.
Yeah.
Trust them as CEOs, train them as CEOs, and that's the only way you're going to drive change.
There's been a huge investment in the principalship in Chicago. I mean, right? Yeah.
There has, Jen, and I'll even add a little more color to it.
Good.
So first of all, so more context. So Chicago is the only district in the country where schools have local school councils who actually choose the principal. And there's a whole bunch of stories that I can tell you in Arne's time when he didn't agree with who the person was, but he had no choice.
Oh.
And so he would just make a comment during the board meetings about it, but he had no choice, right? He had to accept it. And so really then the lever became, so then what do you do, right? In my other districts, I've been able to choose my principals. And here, you don't. So we said we got to get really strong on eligibility criteria because, and people disagree with me, minimum qualifications, minimum licensing standards is not enough, right? We have to make, especially in Chicago. And so we really focused on that, a lot of development, a lot of training, we have some amazing pipeline programs like residency programs that now are more popular in districts, but in our time, they were like the pioneering programs. I mean, New Leaders was just up and coming and started out, partially in Chicago. So many of the pipeline programs that you might read about today, many of them started in districts like Chicago back in the 2000s. Fast forward, I have an interesting tension issue. So my principals, their compensation is so high that there's no incentives for them to come to central office. And so I'm constantly getting pushed on this, by the way. And I said, I like it. By the way, it's also now for teachers too. It's so teachers are making their compensation is so high. There's not a lot of incentives for them to become administrators. But focusing on principals, and what I say, to our staff, I say, well, look, I love it when a principal has been in their school for 20 years. I can't help it. It brings me joy. I love going through that building, especially because knowing, that during this time, that school, with that stability, has shown academic growth, has shown significant gains. And so for me, and they know all the families, and they know generations of the families. Like, how do I put a price on that? And look, we're all ambitious, right? I have nothing against ambition. My thing is, if you want to become a network chief, or you want to become a central office, leader, that's because you have a passion for that work. Right? It shouldn't be the money that drives, because one of my pet peeves in doing this for 20 years, it shouldn't be the money that drives a teacher out of a classroom. It shouldn't be the money that drives a school leader out of a building. Right? It shouldn't be. And that's during our time, that was the way the system was set up. And so now I have just this other problem now, and so it's interesting, and I'm sort of still reflecting on it quite a bit. So those investments were key. The other one I would just add, and I'll have to give credit to, Dr. Elmore, God rest his soul. He was working with us in Chicago during the 2000s era.
I remember
and I'll tell you, his instructional core work, his coherence work, we talk about it every day.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous.
It's in our schools. It's in our classrooms. It drives our work. So along with the PELF framework, it's all interconnected. So regardless of the changes that happen at the CO superintendent level, that work goes deep. And because it's tied to the research partners we have, teachers and school leaders believe in it. And so when you really tie that together, I feel like that's part of the magic. And I do feel, Harvard Education, department really should take some credit for that.
Thank you. I just want to emphasize, like, the theory. We're just looking at one prong of the theory, right? Which is this focus on principles. And it works because you've organized yourself to make it work, right? Over decades now, continuously improving how you support principals in doing their work. It's never perfect. But you also talked about data use as being another major prong of the strategy. I mean, in Chicago, I mean, data is a really big deal. We've sometimes not used it kindly, right?
So I will say on this, and this is an interesting conversation we're having today in Chicago. So the culture is very strong. The data-driven culture is very strong. Started again during the 2000s. I think it just got stronger as we get into the 2010 era.
Yeah.
And it's not just, it's at the school leader level, it's at the teacher level. One of the things that I love is that today, 90% of our schools are using common diagnostics. And they don't have to. They're all optional because by union contracts, teachers have to vote, which I actually think is a good process because they actually have to vote on diagnostics that they use or not to use. And I will tell you, because our teachers wanted to know how their children were doing. And even in my own personal experience with our teacher-parent conference, the amount of rich information that we have about our children. By the way, we're even getting better on social and emotional learning data because we've always had good academic data. Social and emotional data is still an area that's still evolving, and that culture is deep. And it is and frankly, what I like about it is it really helps to drive our strategies. It really helps us to know whether, as we're implementing our curriculum, what are the strategies that are working, and especially now because we have different support systems for our students. In the next few years, we're going to have a lot of insight about what is the right elements that really make a successful daily student experience. What are the right elements that help our students accelerate learning? And so we've had that with the consortium, but I think even now, because we have even these diagnostics, and we have just again these other supports that we built on, but they're built on this foundation.
Graduation rate, I thought, was the North Star for some reason. Wasn't it for you, Arne?
Yeah, well, I'll go that chart, yes. And Janice talked about the public-private partnership. So I remember, Pedro, you were probably there, but the consortium would come in every year and sort of brief us as we were going back to school. And our senior team, I'll never forget, it was like a gut punch, but they showed this chart that seems obvious now, but we just didn't know in having to research that basically my math won't be exact, but if you had no Fs as a freshman, you basically graduated. If you had one F, you had a 80% chance of graduating. If you had two Fs, you had a 60%. If you had three Fs, it's a 40% chance. If you had more. So the whole thing is not the graduation rate, it's freshmen on track.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if you're trying to stop dropouts, no one drops out senior year, and almost no one drops out junior year. It's early. Yeah. And so that changed. I remember sitting there and looking at the screen and clicking through this, and it was like, I'm getting chills now thinking about it. That was a watershed moment. So our budget was tight. We threw a ton of money into summer transition between 8th and 9th grade, summer bridge.
Freshman academy.
Freshman academy. If a kid misses you can't wait till they miss 2 weeks. If they miss a day, you got to be calling and checking and just being there. And so that for me was a game changer. We didn't have a research team. We're a poor urban district. You don't have that capacity. And again, being vulnerable, giving U of C everything you have. But that enabled us, I think, to change how we budgeted, how we prioritized. I don't remember exactly what year, it was early on in my tenure. And I'm like, this is the game. We got to, and we're not even in the game. So you got to change everything to do that. So that was not my brilliant idea or anyone else's brilliant idea. It was them coming with hard evidence that this is the game and you guys don't get it yet.
Right. But you had to listen to it and believe it and act upon it in order for it to happen.
It's pretty obvious.
Yeah. Well, I think people get, our data is presented to them and sometimes they don't want to see it. And so, definitely should take some credit for that. I think I'll speak to it from the practitioner lens because I was a principal at the time. And I was sharing with Jen earlier that there was kind of a group of early adopters. There was about 8 to 10 high school principals who worked with the Network for College Success.
And this was on 9th grade on track.
This was on 9th grade on track. And it was just a small group where the researcher who did the study that Arne was just referencing, Melissa Roderick, came in and she was just showing us the same data. And as a principal, it felt actionable. Yeah. I felt empowered. I worked in a school in, tough community, open enrollment. The average freshman test scores was maybe at a 5th or 6th grade level. So at the time, the accountability policy said I needed to get them to an 11th grade level. That felt impossible in some cases. We did it every day. We worked hard. But when the freshman on track work came about and there was clear data that if you do this, students will successfully complete high school, I felt empowered. And then at the same time, the district was pumping the resources into it, the data system, so we're getting reports about the kids, and we're able to do these kind of short cycle assessments to intervene and get kids on track. But I think the most important decision, and I believe this was made under Arne's tenure, I'm almost certain it was, because a lot didn't happen after that for a while, but was making it a part of the accountability policy.
Yeah.
And I remember as a principal, because I was an early adopter, I remember some of my principal colleagues were like, this is unfair. Like, they're already dinging us on graduation, now we gotta, and I'm like, no, like this is something that we need to do. And I feel like making that a part of how schools were rated and how we were rated as principals was a really important idea. And so for folks leading out there, really thinking about the levers you have, like it's not always just standing up and giving a motivational speech and convincing people to do it. Sometimes there are policy levers that you can use in order to get what you need done in your district. And part of the leadership challenge is not being afraid to do that. You know, any policy introduction could be the day you go home fired, right? But Arne pushed that, and I know we've pushed a lot of those things that were sometimes seen as controversial, but you look back 10, 20 years later, and you've impacted the lives of thousands of children.
So one quick add there, just for this audience, like for me, we're talking about graduation rates. It's really not graduation rates, not college going rates, not college scholarships. We can talk about that. In Chicago, if you drop out of high school, I'm gonna get emotional here, you may not live. Like, this is really life and death.
Right.
Like, there is no, you know, I work with a lot of violence now. I'm not working with high school graduates.
Right.
And so this is way more fundamental than that. And so that's why you have to have huge urgency.
Yeah.
There's no, Chicago's a tough city. There's no safety net there. And if you're dropping out of high school, it's not just poverty, it's not just social failure. Your risk of being killed goes up exponentially. And so that's why this work is so serious.
Well, and I want to just build a little bit because, I mean, we're all data-driven leaders. I think what also happens is that the data becomes evidence. It becomes evidence about practices and culture. And when I think about what this work kicked off was really our staff, our school leaders, our teachers who already worked really hard, our counselors, really looking at how do we change the culture? Because what we were seeing also in the research was the reason students were dropping out was they didn't feel connected to their school. They didn't feel that there were value there. They weren't felt seen. And by the way, we still have a lot of work to do there, so I want to call that out. But when I look at the structures that have been created over the last decade and a half, I can say that if you go to any one of my high schools, you can see that we know when students are failing. We know when students are struggling. We have efforts to reach out. It doesn't mean we're successful all of the time. Right. Still have a lot of other work in other areas, but that culture now exists. And so when it wasn't just definitely the data was important, being honest about the data, but it was really also having the conversations of what does that mean as adults? What does that mean as staff of what our support systems are for students? It's actually evolved even now more, especially with the pandemic, around making sure that we have ways to address mental health challenges, ways to address behavioral challenges. Again, still a struggle. We're not there yet. But again, it's building on the same concept of this has to be built into the culture of the school. Because everybody, when you're 14 years old and you're trying to figure out life, if you don't feel connected, if you don't feel like somebody cares, the reality is you're going to drop out. And what I love, and this is built in some of our work we're seeing now with our dual credit, dual enrollment, because our staff are so on top of how students are doing, academically and now mentally and socially, we're even building now on some of the gains, and we can talk about that later.
What I love about what you're saying is the why and the urgency about the why. It's not only crystal clear, it's easy to get behind, easy to understand, right? That we need every child to graduate for the reasons that you're describing, and so that they can have, the lives that they deserve. And that the kind of the prongs of the theory of action strategy underneath it, like you've built out like systems, infrastructure, and that these ways of working are changing the culture of schools. I mean, it's simple and elegant. I know under the hood it is messy. In a school district as large as CPS, it's bound to be. What do you think has made that work? We've already had clues in this conversation, but what has allowed it to be sustainable over this period of time? It's like, this is the question.
a hard one. Well, I mean, I think we've talked about some of it, but I think that you really got to understand that it's a entire ecosystem of people supporting this, or as Tony Bright would say in his new book, Exoskeleton, which I really don't understand that analogy, but I know people use it. But I think that it's not just the leader. You have these public-private partnerships. We're taking advantage of the post-secondary institutions there, the philanthropic community. I mean, there are a lot of folks who are vested in what is happening in CPS, and I think that helps. So like, even if Pedro came in and had a bunch of wild ideas about what he would want to do, there's a group of people who are like, well, this is what we're paying attention to. And then you got to make choices. Now, some stuff has changed or shifted as it has under every leadership, under every leader, but there are a bunch of people who kind of hold true to these things. So I think that's number one. So how do you create things that are long lasting, that outlive you and your time? I think that's also a part of the culture of leading in Chicago. Like you don't want to be the one to mess it up, and you also want to make sure you leave some kind of legacy, specifically around impacting student outcomes and equity. I think those are two things that people care a whole lot about during their time there, those who want to be successful. And I think that culture has helped us to sustain some of these practices.
This is really interesting to me because there are a lot of people in the audience, our students who want to work in school systems, but also people who want to work in different parts of that ecosystem. And I hear you saying, Janice, that part of your role, if you're going to be in like in an organization adjacent, right, to the school system, part of your role is to hold that leader accountable, right? I mean, it's so interesting to me. Do you have anything to add to that, Arne, given you've been out for a while?
Yeah.
Looking back?
No,
Well, Arne holds us accountable. So when I was in the
calls you up.
He would call like, oh, if you're having some trouble in the news, okay, did you think about this? Or I saw you're getting, you're not getting favorable press on this thing. Have you thought about this? Or just checking on me. So I think that some of that is there. Pedro knows sometimes I might see something and be, if you need help, so I think there is that part of us, like, I think there's some of that too, that you feel accountable to people who started some of the work there, because a lot of them are still around. It's not like we see each other at events all the time. So we're like still around. And I think that helps as well.
So Jen, I would also add, and this may sound a little counterintuitive to some leaders, one thing that I appreciate about Chicago is the accountability is clear. If I'm not doing my job, if any of my schools are not doing the job, we can't hide. And I do feel that for me, I don't mind that pressure. Sometimes, I'm not saying I love every minute of it. Doesn't mean I don't complain to my wife about it every once in a while. But I will tell you, there's a healthy pressure there. And I think we do have to always acknowledge, especially in Chicago, there are communities that have been underinvested for decades. There are still many of my students that have living conditions, frankly, that they're not set up for success, right? And we have to do our part in K-12, but we also have to say we can't do it by ourselves, which is why we need partners. Yeah. We need community-based organizations. And so, one thing that I see is having that healthy tension. What it does, in my opinion, it keeps us grounded that the work is not done. It has to continue. And as Janice said, and the work is, and the goal is to move it forward. It's not about an individual leader. It's not about an individual. I've said this, if you have a big ego, Chicago's not going to be your district. I mean, I could be wrong, but it's just not going to be your district. If you have an interest to really understand how to continue to build on a system and make it stronger with all the challenges that come with it, I think Chicago is a really interesting district. I think it's more interesting than New York. I think it's more interesting than LA. Because I do believe that the strengths that we have built over the last 20 years, with all the challenges we still have, and we still have a ways to go, the teacher capacity, the school leader capacity, and I'll say this, I cannot stop raving about the talent that I have in our district. I mean, and I know every leader probably does it, but I got to tell you, I said, I'll show you. I'll take you to classrooms. I'll take you to schools. I'll show it to you. It is just so, and it's deep. And so the challenge is how do you keep that talent? How do you leverage it so that we continue to get stronger? because we still have a ways to go.
Sorry, what are the biggest threats? What's the stuff that has kept you up at night?
Well, I think
Yeah.
you hit on it at the beginning. The biggest one when I was there, and I think still probably the biggest, is enrollment. In Chicago, just talking about some of the parts of our history that are not as pleasant. You know, we had the largest number of school closings, and, you know, everybody who's focused on education has paid attention to that. And, you know, while I will agree that there, you know, in hindsight, we could have done a better job doing that. I was a principal at the time, but still own a lot of that, and did close schools while I was superintendent. They needed to close for a variety of reasons. Some of it was around right sizing, some of it was around academic performance, et cetera. And what has happened as a result of the fallout from that, we've been unable to really address some of those issues. And so I don't envy Pedro. We, you know, left him with a lot of that. And we were in the middle of addressing some of those concerns and came up with a model that I thought really spoke to, first of all, solving the issue, but also respecting the community and engaging them in the process as much as possible.
Yeah.
I don't want to pretend like people are ever happy when you close a school. That will never occur. But there are some things you can do to try to, you know, make that less disruptive than it was under, you know, with the 50 school closings.
Oh, yeah.
And one example was a model that we had set about doing when I was there with a school called Inglewood. And if you don't know anything about Chicago, you have heard about Inglewood because everybody likes to keep Inglewood in their mouth, okay? But we, as a city, put a big investment because there are a lot of challenges in that community, but there's a lot of beauty and there are a lot of hardworking people. And so there were a lot of economic investments. You know, first time they got a Whole Foods and a Starbucks and new city colleges. So a lot of investments happened there. But the reality was there were 4 comprehensive high schools in that community, and 90% of the kids who lived within the boundaries went somewhere else. So like, even though we were pretending like we can't close schools, the parents and the students were voting with their feet and going somewhere else. And not that it was a perfect process, because I was called every name under the sun, but we closed those schools. We modified our plan because of community pushback, but more importantly, we built something new and better quickly.
Yeah.
And I think in the past, especially coming from these communities, you're just accustomed to people taking away resources and not replacing them. Or when they are replaced, they're for someone else. And so I think that that's the biggest threat to CPS when I was there. And the reason this is a huge issue is because of the finances connected to it. You just can't continue to operate any organization with those types of inefficiencies.
Yeah.
But even from an educational standpoint, quality teachers it's going to be really hard to attract the teachers that you need in a school where enrollment is dwindling. And people want to force us to ignore that. And so if we really believe that every student deserves a high quality education, access to great teachers, you got to create conditions within the school that make teachers want to be there. Yeah. And in some of those schools, those conditions do not exist. And a lot of it is because of those enrollment challenges and some of the historical things that have occurred. And so we did a risk assessment when I was there, and enrollment was at the top of the list because it impacted social emotional concerns, academic concerns, and also our fiscal stability.
It sounds like a technical thing, everybody.
Oh, no.
But, right? These issues and the decisions that you make related to them can undermine trust permanently.
Yes.
Right? So despite all the good work that you've been doing, right? It's a legacy of mistrust. It's hard to address.
Yeah, and I would say, Jen, that's what I see as, one of my biggest challenges is there is so much mistrust out in the community, and the media plays along with it as well. And so, and I think, what I've told our school leaders is, let's own the complexity. So are results getting better? Yes. Did we see 87% of our schools make gains in reading last year? Yes, we did. The highest gains we've had since 2016. 70% make gains in math, record graduation rate, record scholarships, record college credits. I can give you evidence points over and over, right, at scale. But we still have a community, including, my experience that I went through CPS, other parents that went through CPS, grandparents, that their experience may not have been great.
Right.
And so know that that's their lens. And so we have to prove to them, we have to show, and I think it's on us, we have to prove to them that we are making things better, and we have to acknowledge the areas that we're not. And so, for me, it's this balance of, we got to continue this path of showing improvement because students are doing better, the system is getting stronger, but also acknowledging this mistrust does exist and it goes deep. And it's not, and I'll be humble about this, it's going to take a while to build that trust. I mean, you know this. When you lose that trust, it's easy to lose. It's very difficult to build.
Very difficult.
And I've been now in multiple cities and I've seen where there are different stages of that trust, right? I've seen it where the trust was still there. It was starting to get weaker, so you had to build to strengthen it. And then in Chicago, what I've seen is a significant amount of mistrust. I mean, we have really depleted that for many reasons. And so for us, the goal is we have to build that trust because we're starting to see stability in enrollment for the first time in 10 years. We started seeing signs of it even last year. And for me, what I'm looking at is, can we keep this up, right? Like this is either this becomes a marker for us to say we're gonna be building trust, because I see it as an evidence point. Because like Janice said, the good thing about Chicago is parents will walk with their feet, not only within the district, but also outside of the district.
Two quick thoughts. I want to answer directly on the threat. So I am, I'm very concerned about a shift from an elected to an appointed board. That's for me is a huge threat. And I just want to elaborate on because it's interesting to have you both say it, sort of the enrollment issue. So when I was there, it was about 400,000. You're at 322.
322.
322. So you've lost
10 years.
20%. So that's real. But I want to, again, there's complexity here just for this audience. Chicago's a big city. It's also, racially segregated city. I don't think we have a Latino population issue. In fact, our schools and Latino communities are often bursting at the seams. What we have had in Chicago, and again, I'll go back to the gun violence, we've had a reverse migration of black families back down south because they're worried about their sons being killed. And so these are issues that school systems can't handle by themselves. And absent that honest conversation, you have that reverse migration of black families. You have young families, as soon as they have kids, they move to the suburbs because they don't feel safe. And so it's not a lack historically of people in the city. It's our inability as a city to make people feel safe and comfortable. And so that's bigger. It impacts CPS directly, but if you're not looking at those root causes, if you're not making Englewood and other neighborhoods safer, there's no magic that school can do to keep that population. I just want to put the complexity on the table for this audience to understand.
Can we just stay on the threat for one more minute? And we're going to go to audience questions soon, I promise. In Chicago, I'm looking at Bing in the audience because he led this department for a while. There is what's called a portfolio strategy, or that's what it was named over time. I'm not sure that's what it was called back in the day. But basically, Chicago's made up of different kinds of schools. Your traditional neighborhood schools, magnet schools, charter schools, and there are other kinds of schools in the mix too. How has that, I'm just going back to this issue of trust and threats. How has that, it's such a big part of who Chicago is. How has that played out? Diminished trust, strengthened it? I have no idea. I'm just curious about how that plays into the story.
I'll go quick because just hear from other folks. I'll just give philosophically what I believe historically in not just Chicago, but America. I'll take urban America. You basically had one option, and that was your local public school. And sometimes that was a good option, sometimes it was a mediocre option, sometimes that was a horrific option. And that's all you had. I don't think that's fair to families. I think in a perfect world, take an urban, it gets done work rural, in an urban area, if you had access to a fine and performing arts school focus, a school with an IB curriculum, a school that focused on STEM, a school that focused on art, so you have a chance to do dual enrollment. Every kid learns differently in a household, and every kid has different strengths and weaknesses. So for me, in a dream world, every family would have 3, 4, 5 high-quality options and let them figure out what's right for their kid. It's not for, it'd be the height of arrogance for any of us to do that. So that's, again, not everyone agrees with that. That's a controversial thought, but I just want to put on the table, that's what I believe is I want to give parents great options, and I'm agnostic whether that's a traditional school or a magnet school or a charter school. I say, no 7-year-old knows whether I go to charter, a magnet, or IB. Just, do I have a great teacher? Am I cared about just a pencil? I want schools to look like that. So that's, I'll be quiet.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we are in agreement in a lot of ways on this. Let me start with the portfolio model. Number one, I believe in it. And I think if we're answering whether or not it's successful, there are a variety of ways to take on that question. But if you look at a few key indicators, one, more choice for parents, as Arne pointed out. Chicago Public Schools has more of a market share of school-age children than they've ever had. I was sharing this earlier. When I went to school in CPS in the 80s, early 90s, you only went to the public school if you were poor. Even on my block, I had people who were bus drivers and had, middle class or working class jobs. If they had $2 extra, they were using it to send their kids to the private schools that were probably not different academically, but were deemed safer, and parents were exercising choice in a system that they did not think would serve their students. And we have to spend more time just unpacking what you get when parents are engaged in that way. I think the other piece, without me going too deep on this, the reason I get a little up in arms around the choice issue, number one, I experienced it. My parents didn't know they were exercising school choice. We all went to our neighborhood elementary school, but there was no way we could go to our neighborhood high school. I remember that in my house. My father was like, nobody is going to the neighborhood high school. My father was a cab driver. He drove us all over the city for our brothers and sisters to go to Hyde Park, Whitney Young, all over the city, because we could not go to the neighborhood school. And they had some advantages, although we were working poor, in that there was a car, there was a way to get around, there was money to send 5 kids to different schools all over the city. But there are a bunch of people who only have the option that's there. I think creating the charters, we're lucky in Chicago, charters are authorized by the city. So even if kids go to charters, that's counted in that 322. So if anybody's wondering how we went from 500,000 to 322, it's not charter schools. That's all lumped together.
Yeah.
This is what drives me nuts on the school choice, and I'm going to leave it here.
Okay.
The only group that people think they have a right to tell them what schools they need to go to are poor and largely Black children. It's the only group. Nobody would ever question Arne exercising school choice.
Right.
No, but everybody wants to fight and have a paternalistic view around what poor Black children should do and where they should go to school. And there is so much underneath that. There is a lot of keep them out of my neighborhood. There is so much underneath that. And those arguments are sometimes masked as equity arguments, when really it's about keeping people away from our children. We need a certain percentage, and if it goes over that percentage, we're all uncomfortable. That's what it's all about. And so if the alternative is a great neighborhood school with every single resource for you to be successful, and 99% of the kids are Black, let me tell you, a lot of Black people would love that school. They would go there. They'd be happy to go there. Look at our HBCUs. They would thrive there. The reality is this country is not built. There are very few examples of places like that where almost all or overwhelming majority of the kids are Black, and you get the quality that many of the people in this room have experienced through their education. So when people come to me and question choice, if they don't have a way to solve for that, they can stop talking to me, because I'm going to do through policy and leadership the same thing my dad did, which is make sure all of his kids have a chance. And that's why they had an 80% graduation rate for Black kids compared to where we are in this country, because they utilize every single thing so their kids can be successful. I want to make it easier for parents like that and create a system where they can exercise that kind of choice. So I'm never going to be anti-choice. Just want to say that, because I feel like it's anti-Black in a lot of ways, in my opinion.
Yeah. Thank you, Janice.
So it's interesting, so the system got created, choice system in Chicago created, probably, no other district, maybe New York is the only one that's comparable, maybe a little bit of Boston, but even the way Chicago did is very different.
Yeah.
I was gone for 12 years. I went and saw other systems where there was vertical alignment between high school, middle school, elementary schools. No test in, by the way, and I kept that out of the districts that I was in, not testing kids in. And to say all that, again, is the system stronger today? I would say it is. But I think we have to acknowledge there's unintended consequences that occurred throughout this process. So, for example, evidence point, my students that travel the farthest to go to what they feel is a high quality option is my Black students. So even choice, you know, making sure that we understand what it means for certain families versus other families. And really what I see right now is an opportunity. I see an opportunity to build off of our strong programming and really start looking, and I have some neighborhood high schools right now that are just kicking butt. I mean, they are just like, I mean, I want to scream at the top of my lungs how strong they are. And in some cases, the families already see it. I'm seeing it with their enrollment. In other cases, I have to keep pushing because that mistrust exists.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think it gets complicated, you know, as when you build a system of choice, but along the line also you create a lot of mistrust in the community, because what it does is it hurts the neighborhood schools. And even as they're getting stronger, they're still trying to build that trust. And so I just want to call that out. I see an opportunity.
Yeah.
I really do, because I mean, you know, we were just looking at one of my students, Julian High School, $1 million in scholarships that just, you know, we just kind of posted it on social media today. But I'm seeing students across my neighborhood high schools that are just doing phenomenal work. And when I look at my dual credit, dual enrollment work, it's being targeted towards our neighborhood high schools. And I'll tell you, it's the first time that we're not seeing race gaps, where not only are students graduating, but they're graduating with college credit, including associate's degree. By the way, Inglewood STEM, their first cohort, students were graduating with associate degrees.
Amazing.
So
Love
neighborhood
that.
They had a
school,
lot,
neighborhood
yeah.
school, right?
Yeah.
And so I just want to make sure we call that out, that as we think about systems of choice, understanding the unintended consequences it has in some neighborhoods, and particularly neighborhoods with Black students,
Yeah.
and how do we make sure that we leverage both, right? That we still have some great options, but at the same time, understanding that, you know, choice is going to look different for different families based on the resources that they have at home.
But I
Okay.
think Inglewood is a great example, and if you think about the total investment, it's a $120 million building. You get all the people back in. Every partner, I know when we built the school, every partner wanted to be in Inglewood. I had to tell people, look, we have 140 other high schools you can invest in. Everybody wanted to go. The reality is we're not making hundreds of millions of dollars of investments in these communities
Right.
consistently. Like, there hasn't even been a big one like that since then. And so the parents are discerning. That's one of the things that I learned. Like, we think the parents don't know because they're not, you know, coming to board meetings, but they know. They're not going to come and argue with us. And if you've been Black and poor in this country, you just think that's the way that it is. They're going to figure it out. But they're not going to go to those schools and pray to be the one or only, when they can go to a Whitney Young and know that 90-some% of those kids are going to college and going to great colleges. And so we have to, like, acknowledge those complexities, but we also got to respect what the families ultimately want, which is the same thing our kids want. And they know that the quality is not the same. And we got to step it up and make more quality options. And it requires hundreds of millions of dollars in investments that we simply don't have.
Yeah.
So that's a big problem.
We're going to go to audience questions, but as we're transitioning to that, I just want to point out that this theory of change that we've talked about, that has existed for 20 years, you know, the focus on principles, data use, right, that kind of ongoing slog of improvement and meeting the needs of individual kids is happening kind of in a larger system. At HGSE, this is something that Richard Elmore used to always ask, who's best positioned to do what work?
Yeah.
And what you're pointing to is, yeah, we need the principals doing the day-to-day work, you know, with teachers, helping to meet the needs of every single child. And we, like this kind of group, is responsible figuring out how to have this system of quality schools.
Yeah.
And that is work that's never going to end. All right, let's go for it. Q&A, everybody. We've got mics over here. I just asked, I think there's a slide somewhere, I have no idea where it is, that says something like, make sure you ask an actual question, okay? Like, that's what we want to do. Not a speech, a question. Here we go. A question takes less than 30 seconds to ask. It ends with a question mark.
And not all the panelists need to.
Right, and not every panelist has to respond. Okay, let's get right to it. And I'm going to ask Riley if you could say who you are and go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. My name is Riley Jones. I'm a doctoral student in the EDLD program. I'm also a CPS alum, pre-K through high school. So my question is, my freshman year of high school was the year that Darian Albert was killed. And so I spent a lot of my high school journey really trying to escape violence. How does investing in solutions that address issues that kids are facing outside of school or even parents are facing make a more equitable public school system in Chicago?
Thanks, Riley. I think that's a great one for you, Arne.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. This is how I'm spending all day, every day, working on this. And I actually haven't talked to Pedro about this, but I want to. Our kids now, younger and younger, are dealing with a level of violence and trauma that no one, it's not a critique of social workers, not a critique of counselors. They're not prepared to deal with this. They don't understand the dynamics. And so I have individual schools calling me. What I think we need in Chicago, I can't speak for any other city, is for the men we work with, we have what we call life coaches who help them.
Yeah.
We need to put life coaches into our most at-risk high schools and our most at-risk middle schools. And we need folks who know the street dynamics, who are trained, who are from there. And it's not every kid, and it's not every boy, it's not every black boy, but there's a small percent that are at unbelievable risk. And the challenge, we should talk about this, is that 99% of my life coaches have criminal backgrounds. And they're an amazing talent. And I get CPS has challenges with that, but right now I feel like we're the kids who need the most help, we're denying them their most important resource. So we are literally working with JD in real time, figuring out how to work around that. But I think structurally, right now, we're not in the game. And I think that's a critical piece of it.
Thank you, Arne. Let's go over here.
Hi, my name is Jordan Wetherell. I'm a graduate student here and just moved from Chicago, where I was working at the Illinois State Board of Ed. My question really is about, yeah.
I know. I'm just like, sorry. Thank you for your service.
Well, and that's
She's
where
not good at poker.
I'm not.
That's where my question is coming from. I know, like, one of the things that's really stood out to me in my time being here is just how systems tend to sustain themselves. And when systems have been built up to racially segregate and economically or create economic disparate situations, how do you, especially in Chicago, where it's really hard to build consensus and really hard because of mistrust that we've been talking about, how do you build consensus to actually innovate and to change systems that were built to sustain themselves?
So I think, really starts going back to, working with our school leaders. I think that strategy that we've talked about is what I think makes Chicago one of the, really stronger and more sustainable systems. What I love about our school leaders, and I'll just use the example of the dual credit, dual enrollment. We started pushing that, and now we're pushing pathways so that students who want careers in IT and healthcare, advanced manufacturing, et cetera, we just set up a pathway for cybersecurity with IIT University. And what I love is that because we have this strong foundation, because we're still talking about how do we get more children to graduate. Don't get me wrong, we started talking about freshmen on track, but that's foundational, right? That's just in the ether now. Now we're having these other conversations about how do we get students with more opportunities for economic mobility, right? And building on the strong college supports that we have, which is one of the strongest in the country. And so what that allows us to do is, so at this point, we're able to have those conversations. I think the challenge right now that I see is how do we make sure that we bring these high quality, what Janice was talking about earlier, how do we bring these high quality options that are closer to the students? Because the challenge that I still see, and it gets into safety, it gets into public transportation, our city, I still remember the story. I had a student who was going from the far west side to the far south side. And then he was going because he wanted to be part of a basketball team. And I remember, and the principal who was receiving him back, I remember saying, Charles, think about what his daily route was every single day. Wow. Like I had a picture, was he taking the train down Madison and then taking another train? What does that even look like, right? And so I see an opportunity for us to develop these solutions. It's gonna have to be, in order to build the trust, it has to be with the community itself. I think the biggest challenge I have is just time. Yeah. I know this work is gonna take time. It's not something you can rush. Because again, this trust just doesn't exist. Yeah. I was able to move faster in some of my other districts. Here, I've taken a path of more, I need to make sure I really fully, even though I'm from Chicago, I got to fully appreciate what's happening. And we got to build it together in a way where my school leaders are with me, and they are, and we got to get the community with us. And so I think it's literally just rolling up your sleeves, and we're going to have to deal with these complicated issues, which are not going away. The safety issue is not going away.
Just super quickly, I want to, just leadership class, leadership lessons. For me, the goal is not consensus. The goal is impact. And consensus is important, but you can spend the next 20 years trying to get consensus. I promise, I don't know if she did it right or wrong. I promise you she did not have consensus on the Askwith situation.
I did not.
And so my point is, leaders need to lead. You got to lead from the heart. You got to lead trying to do the right thing for the right reasons. But we got to move. We got to work. So it's a balancing act. But I just want to be clear. The goal is never consensus. The goal is, are you helping increase educational opportunities? And sometimes that just takes a little bit of courage and stepping out.
All right, Amelia, let's go over here.
Hi, I'm Amelia Spalter, an EDM candidate in Professor Chetham's ELOE program. And I run a nonprofit after-school program in an inner city, so Secretary, your and your mother's story is a great source of inspiration for me. And we often receive criticism that the government funding programs like ours receive would be put to better use in the schools, which of course are also struggling. So I'm curious how any of you would recommend leaders in education balance evolving education beyond traditional classroom settings through interventions like extracurricular programs without appearing to siphon off or dismiss public education.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first, that's a great question. And I would say, like, keep doing the work. Like, everything doesn't have to happen in the school, in the classroom. And I think most leaders will tell you they appreciate those wraparound supports, because for a lot of our students, the stability and I guess productive activity happens during that 7-hour day in schools, but then there are a lack of opportunities outside of that that more fluent students have access to. And so your program is adding value. That's an argument you're going to continue to hear. You should listen and figure out and make sure you're collaborating, but I think you need to stay the course. Like, I think it would be a shame not to have those type of opportunities to complement what happens in the school district. And I don't even know what you do, but I know there's a whole ecosystem of people who help support the work that districts do, and I think it's necessary.
Yeah, I would just add that, especially in today's time when we're asking so much of our teachers, not just academically, but also around how do we help our students with social, emotional, and mental health needs, it's more important than ever that we have community-based partners that are working with us, because my dream is that every school should be open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. I mean, every school, and especially for our families who really need that extra support. And that can't happen with teachers. I mean, with all due respect. And I have teachers, by the way, that work longer than that. But for me to ask teachers to do that at scale, it just, we'll burn them out. With all the challenges they have to, and they're already doing a lot, and the evidence is showing that we're having success. The only way to do that is with partners. And I think what we have to do is change the narrative with the states, with the federal government around how do we value that more in our country.
Let's go over to Derek and Monique.
Hi, my name is Monique Miles, and I'm a first-year LLD student, and I've spent the last 11 years working at the Aspen Institute, improving education and career outcomes for youth and young adults of color across the country.
Good evening. My name is Derek Holyfield, and I am a first-year EDOD doctoral student as well, who spent the last 5 years working in Cleveland Public Schools as a principal at an all-boys school. And our question hints on a lot of what you talked about with mistrust. So in the last 20 years, we saw that Chicago graduation rates increased by 40%. So historically, the school district has limited success with helping Black and brown students graduate high school. And so we want to know, how can any harm done in the community be repaired to help parents who did not graduate see value in graduating, and students who grew up not seeing many people with a high school diploma, how do we help them see the value in graduating and continuing their education?
And we decided to ask our question together because Jen prepared us well today. And the themes are connected because you also, Janice and Pedro, tell such a beautiful story of intergenerational outcomes when you talk about what your parents did in sacrifice and then what that means for you all to have access to opportunity. the way that that translates, or the way that I hear it, especially as we think about the instructional coherence that's centered around racial equity, it also sounds like a healing story, an intergenerational healing story. And even while we know, Arne, there's still a real urgency around what healing looks like and feels like, really curious to hear your reflections on what healing has been like for students, for families, intergenerationally as you reflect.
Talk what we're doing now.
Yeah,
So-
I was thinking about that, and I do want to answer specifically around healing because I think a lot needs to be done there to reconcile. But the work that I'm actually doing now is with a nonprofit called Hope Chicago, which I founded 2 years ago. And basically what we've done is adopted 5 CPS high schools. We were very intentional about going to schools where using census data and neighborhood data, the high school attainment levels were low. In some cases, the college attainment levels, in many cases also, the college attainment levels were low. And we offer students a debt-free college education as well as one parent or guardian. So it's a 2-generation model. And a lot of people ask, like, why this as your next act after CPS? And I just share with them, it checks a lot of boxes personally and professionally for me. Number one, it's Chicago, so you have me right there. But we're also bringing a resource directly to the community. And I think what Arne and I have in common in the work we're doing at Hope and what he does at CRED, it's a different way of thinking about philanthropy where we're not top heavy with a bunch of people getting paid to go and do services. Our organizations get resources, and let me not sugarcoat this, we get cash in the hands of families that haven't had it. At Hope Chicago, that looks like money going directly to your bursar bill at the colleges. That's real cash. They don't have to take out loans in order to go to college. They don't have to take out loans and make that financial risk, which they're smart enough to know is not a good financial risk, which is why a lot of kids don't go to college. And in Arne's case, employing men largely so that they can support themselves and their families. And so I think after working in CPS, working directly with students, realizing that that's only one part of it and that you got to try to make the family whole. And we have to stop pretending like that does not include making the family more financially stable. That is the next phase of the civil rights work, if that's what we're serious about. So we're doing it on a scale that I think is larger than has ever been done. We committed to 4,000 families. I know Arne's working with a lot of families as well. But it's still a drop in the bucket compared to like what we have to contend with in Chicago, but we're moving in the right direction. And so that's just one part of the healing journey. But if I'm being honest, like what Pedro talked about earlier, our communities, they've been through a lot. Yeah. And people don't feel good. And so, but with that said, and this is where the power of schools comes in, I don't care where you go, a school is the most resourced institution in these communities that we're talking about. They don't have hospitals, they don't have companies and corporations. The school has the most money, even with shoestring budgets. And so we really have to continue to invest there because even though there's tension in those relationships, that is where most of our families go to sustain themselves and their families.
Yeah, and I would just add, one of the things that I love is to really celebrate our students. Because I will tell you, when you celebrate our students, the whole family comes out. Every event that we go to, and we celebrate scholarships, apprenticeships, we fill up a room that's twice the size of students getting at least 15 college credit hours. And my goal is to fill up McCormick Place, which is our largest, convention center. And so the more and more we celebrate our students, and then we work with the chancellor of the community colleges who now offers free college, education and certificates. So even, in addition to what Janice is doing as well, to really, for parents that want to, really, increase their skills. And so I think we just have to keep talking about it and continue to celebrate because there is a lot of mistrust, right? And as Janice said, there is a lot of hurt feelings from the past. And I think, again, it just takes time, but we just got to keep at it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Take all 4 questions
That's
together.
what I'm trying to figure out.
Why don't you take all 4?
Yeah,
and then we can just
let's hear all 4, and then we'll
divvy them up.
Phil,
Okay.
you go ahead. Tell us your question.
Awesome. Hi, y'all. I'm Phil Chu coming in from New York with a New York-specific question. So mayoral control is always under review in New York State. The Senate is actually going to review mayoral control again in the upcoming months. There's a strong, compelling case for continuity. The 3 of you model it. where there's continuity in leadership, there's sustained growth and impact. Mayoral control is tied a lot, at least in New York City, to the election cycles and the political priorities of the incumbent, whoever the incumbent might be.
Yeah.
What are your perspectives on the merits or the limits of mayoral control in service of continuity of leadership, and also continuity of city services, and also its limit as it's tied to short-term election cycles?
All right, thanks, Phil. Alexis, tell us your question, and then, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexis. I'm also a proud CPS alum, K through 12.
Ag school.
Just graduated here from the Harvard Grad School of Education this past May, and share Jen's sentiment of just how much of a powerhouse this panel is. So thank you so much for being here tonight. One of the questions that I have is, my background is in college career success and access. And so I'm wondering, with CPS and the scale at large, and how large of a school district it is, what role and how tangible of that what role and how tangible of action steps can a district at that large take to better support students who are going to be the first in their family to go to college? And as we know, 90% of those students, compared to their counterparts, take 5 years or longer to graduate. And so what can CPS do, other large school districts, to prepare those students at the high school level, so that way, as we talk about upward economic mobility, for them to succeed, and then take those resources back to, hopefully, the Chicago community?
All right, thanks, Alexis.
Hi, I'm Priyanka. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College, and I am really thankful for your guys' perspective today. I think we've heard a lot about the administrative level of the theory of change, but as a student myself, as we all are, I'm really interested to hear your perspective on whether you think that students themselves have a role in education reform, and if you've seen that in Chicago, or if you haven't seen that, if there's anything you'd wish to see from students like us.
Great question, thank you. Okay, last question.
Hello, it's an honor to be here. First and foremost, I enjoy reading the case studies. Thank you, Professor Monica Higgins. I'm a former grad student of Harvard. I really enjoy the case studies regarding to Chicago public school systems, mainly because it reminds me of the work that we do in Harlem under the direction and promise of Jeffrey Canada, people like George Caldoun. It's dear heart to me. I'm a longtime educator. I've been teaching for 20 years. I've done some work in Haiti. I think we crossed paths in 2013. Given your expertise, your experience, and global perspective, Mr. Arne Duncan, what is the best approach, or what is the magical ingredient that enables a marginalized, underserved public school system to be sustainable? And how has your theory of change evolved from a policy standpoint?
Okay, we've got no time left. So each of you, I need you to do two things. Decide to answer any one of those questions, and then give a word of advice to this group of people. Does that sound okay? We're going to combine the two.
Okay.
Who wants to start?
I can start with, and let me start with the question about how do we help our students, really navigate the college system, right, and do it in the shortest period. This is an area that we're reflecting quite a bit. So just a quick data point. As our graduating rates, have risen, our college attendances continue to be very steady at the national average, over 60%. More importantly, our persistence rate is now at 75%. And what I see is, as we're graduating students with more college credits, because one of the things that I feel is a lesson I learned in the last 20 years, we've always talked about college preparation. I really believe for students of color, for students in poverty, they got to be in college. And they have to have access to the pathway they're looking at, which means internships and works, because that's the way they really know whether this is the area they want to be, right? Because to figure that out in college, the reason students take 5, 6 years or more to really graduate is because they're still trying to figure that out. I think it's too late. And so that work, is something that I'm very passionate. So I believe that's what we're going to keep building on, and we're already showing evidence of it. And the other component, just to add, is just the fact that we have to get really smarter about what is happening in the work, in the area of work. And that's not only K-12, but also higher ed. Because I think we make assumptions of what we think, students need in terms of skills, but I don't think we have concrete data, going back to, making data-driven decisions. I don't think we're being strategic enough there. So that's just an area that I'm passionate and that I'm really reflecting a lot on.
What's your advice?
My advice to everyone is, so first of all, as leaders, my advice is jump into the arena. Jump into the arena of the work. I think this work is even though it's very hard, it can be very complicated. I will tell you, all of us, and we said it earlier, even at younger ages, the amount of learning and responsibility you can take on and the amount of impact you can have, I just don't think there's any other area of work that's more exciting. So whether it's in a district, whether it's in a partner that really is deep with that district to really have an impact, I just think, I think we need as much talent as possible because the challenges are complex, and that's how we're going to really, make our country better.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Janice, answer a question. Give us
I think
your advice.
Priyanka, I think that was Priyanka.
Yes.
The question around students, I think it's a great one. And I think I can go through this at length, but I won't. There are a lot of ways to engage students. One of the things we did from a district level, because I think schools do a fairly decent job of that with certain structures, is we had a student advisory council. And when I got there, the student advisory council was just kind of like a little cute thing. Kids got dressed up, they got to come downtown, they meet the CEO. And one of the things that I did is I formatted their student council the same way I did my principal and teacher advisory council, which is not, I'm going to come in and present something to you and you give me feedback and people leave, which is a fine structure and you get feedback. But instead, they were organized around policy changes. And we actually had students who introduced policy changes. One example was they wanted 2 student reps on the local school council versus 1. And the reason this was important to make them understand policy is because I wanted to empower them beyond the 1 year they were in the program and understand that if you want to see change, you can use policy as a lever to do that. Sometimes you'll be successful, sometimes you won't. And so we use that as a way to hear their voice, but also teach them the process. Like, you need to be well researched. Your opinion is not enough. If you want 2 people on the local school council, we have 60% vacancies right now. Does that solve your problem by giving another seat? So, and I think respecting them and engaging them in that process early is a good example of how some district leaders engage students in decision making. So that's my piece of advice on that. And then my overarching piece of advice was already said earlier from Arne, but I just want to lean into this, which is like, if you take on the role as superintendent, and not even just superintendent, sometimes we think you have to have the formal title or be the principal to make tough decisions. Every single one of you, if you're in a decision-making position, which I'm almost certain you are if you're working in education, you have an opportunity to bring about change. And most people are afraid to do that. That's just the reality. They say a lot of stuff. I'm sure people say a lot of stuff in your graduate classes. All those discussions are fun. But when it's really time to make a decision and piss people off or risk your job, all those things, people kind of freeze. And I'm not saying you should go off and just be wild and make a lot of crazy decisions. But every once in a while, there is an opportunity to change a system, to disrupt the status quo. And it's rare in your career. So if you're faced with that and you don't take an opportunity, you probably won't get it again. And just be prepared to live with that. So I just want to encourage you, if you are faced with an opportunity where you can really change and disrupt and you have the things lined up, you should move on that, because the likelihood of you getting 3, 4, 5 of those in your career is very slim. And so don't squander that opportunity.
Love it. Thank you. All right, Arne, bring it home.
4 very quick things. First, I got to thank PELP. PELP was an incredibly helpful for us. These jobs are lonely jobs. There's no one else in your city doing it. To come and meet with your team and get out of the day-to-day and spend time with other folks, that was invaluable. So I can't leave here and not say that. So thanks to you. That's 1. 2, just one quick on the student voice. I think every superintendent should have a student advisory council, meet with every month. I still keep in touch from mine from now 16 years ago. One of that group just became alderman in Chicago. And so it's like they made me better.
Yeah.
I think I have a great idea, like, Arne, you're crazy. And I listened every time. They had ideas I didn't have, but it's leadership development for them. So that's just a concrete example. 3rd, where's my Haiti guy? Yeah. You hit me hard. I go back to Haiti every year. I'm going back in January. A lot of work to do there. But whether it's Haiti or any under-resourced community, I would just say what I'm always pushing for, and for you guys to think about, is I want parents to be more demanding. And the pressure we always get I'll speak for myself. Pressure I always get was I was going too fast, and there's legitimate critique there. I think we're all going too slow. I think Chicago's the fastest improving district in the country. That's great. I promise you Chicago's going too slow. And what we need is more parents demanding. No parent ever kicked down my door saying my dropout rate is too high in my high school. I didn't have enough access to computers. And so just asking, wanting that accountability, wanting that pressure. Very, very quick story. President Obama always told a story of meeting with the president of South Korea, and he said, what's your biggest challenge? He said, right away, the biggest challenge in South Korea, the president said, my parents are too demanding. That all my parents, even my poorest parents, demand that their kids learn education in first grade. And people in America get real quiet when they hear that. What if it doesn't matter who's the president in South Korea, they're gonna have a great education system. We need to encourage, not push back. We encourage parents to demand more of all of us sooner, faster.
Did Karen Math have an influence on you?
And Vice, very quickly, there's no right place. So in school, policy, nonprofit, philanthropy, we just need your talent. And honestly, it's inspiring. We need the next generation to come up and do more. So worry less about the place, worry more about the impact, and you can move. We've Pedro worked for Archdiocese, now he's doing public. We work for the system, and now we're running a nonprofit. There's no right or wrong place. Where can you go and have impact, and don't chase the next job title. Don't, are you making a difference in young people's lives? And we need a lot more people in a lot more different seats doing that, and that matters much more than the actual spot where you are working.
Roll up your sleeves. Get in there, right? We need you. That was great.